The morning I came off that last shift, the sky over the valley was the color of wet slate, and I remember thinking that slate was the color of a lot of things in my life just then. I had worked 12 hours at the hospice on the ridge above our town, holding the hand of a man named Ellery who was 81 and who had asked me, near the end, if I thought he had been a good father. I told him yes. I told him that the way his daughter had sat beside him for 3 straight nights was its own kind of answer. He squeezed my fingers, and by the time the morning nurse came in to relieve me, he had gone and I had washed my hands in the small sink in the hallway and listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights and told myself, as I had been telling myself for 2 years, that I could do one more day. My name is Cora Brockett-Wren, though everyone who loved me had always called me Cora. And at 42, I was already learning that a woman can carry more than she thinks she can, so long as she does not sit down in the middle of the road. My husband Tate had been killed in a logging accident 23 months and 4 days before that morning. And I counted it that way not because I wanted to, but because grief has its own arithmetic, and it does not ask your permission. Tate had been a tall, broad-shouldered man who laughed easily and sang off-key and knew the names of every bird that passed over our little rented house in the foothills. He had been dropping a yellow poplar on a steep grade up near Spruce Pine, and the tree had kicked, and that had been the end of 21 years of being known by someone. I drove home in the old Ford that smelled of coffee and cedar shavings because Tate had always kept cedar shavings in the glove box to freshen the cab, and I had never had the heart to throw them out. The heater did not work well, so I wore his old canvas coat over my scrubs, and the sleeves were too long, and I liked it that way. The road dropped down out of the ridge and crossed the creek twice and came up into the little unincorporated pocket of western North Carolina that we called home. I pulled into the gravel drive just as the kitchen light came on, and I knew Penny Rose was up and pouring milk on her cereal the way she did every morning, cross-legged on the kitchen chair, her dark hair still tangled from sleep. Penny Rose was 12 that year, and she had her father's eyes, which were the gray-green of river stones, and she had my stubbornness, which I considered both a blessing and a warning. She had been 9 when we lost Tate, and she had done what children do, which is survive in ways that look like silence for a long time before they look like anything else. She had started writing in a little spiral notebook she kept under her pillow, and I had never once opened it, because some things belong only to the person who is trying to say them. That morning, she looked up when I came in and said, "Mama, you look tired." And I said, "I am tired, baby, but I am here." And she nodded, as if that were a contract between us. I made her oatmeal because the cereal was nearly gone, and I packed her a sandwich and an apple, and the last of the peanut butter crackers from the cupboard. While she brushed her teeth, I stood at the window and watched the light come up over the ridge and thought about the electric bill that was sitting on the counter and the propane tank that was down to 11% and the transmission that had started to slip on the Ford. I did the math the way I always did it, which is to say I did it and then put it in a drawer in my head and closed the drawer. You cannot nurse a dying man at 2 a.m. if you are also trying to add up the month in your head, and so I had learned not to add up the month until the sun was at least a finger above the trees. We got in the truck, and I drove her the 6 miles to the middle school, and she talked to me about a book she was reading, some fantasy thing about a girl who could speak to horses, and I listened and made the right noises and told her I loved her when she jumped out at the drop-off. She waved at me from the steps, and I waited until she was inside the doors before I pulled away, because I had made a promise to myself that I would always watch her all the way in, every single day, because I could not know which day would be the day she needed to turn around and see me still there. My phone rang before I had gotten 2 miles back down the road, and I knew who it was before I looked, because the ring had that particular quality that certain calls acquire in your life. It was Tatianna Wren, my mother-in-law, Tate's mother, and I let it go twice before I answered, because I needed to be a certain kind of person to answer her, and I had to gather that person up from wherever she had gone. When I finally picked up, I said, "Good morning, Tatianna," and she said, without greeting, You should let me raise her. You can't even afford to keep the lights on." I pulled the truck over onto the shoulder because I did not trust my hands on the wheel when Tatianna spoke to me, and I watched a crow lift off a fence post, and I took a breath that I hoped she could not hear. "The lights are on, Tatianna," I said, which was true at that particular moment. "Penny-Rose is fed, she is in school, and she is loved." Tatianna made the small sound she always made when I said something she considered self-serving, a sound like air leaking out of a tire, and then she said, "You are stubborn, just like he said you were." She hung up before I could answer, which was a mercy, because I did not have an answer ready, and I sat on the shoulder for another minute with my forehead against the steering wheel, and I let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the crow to cross the field. Then I wiped my face on Tate's canvas sleeve, and I put the truck in drive, and I went home to sleep for 6 hours before my next shift. It was 3 days later that the call came from my grandfather. And by came from him, I mean it came from the county hospital in Boone, where he had been admitted the night before. And a nurse whose voice was very gentle told me that Mr. Felix Upchurch had asked for me and that I should come when I could, and that when I could should probably be today. I had not seen my grandfather in almost a year because the drive was 3 hours each way into the high country, and because he had not wanted visitors while he was still well enough to protect his pride. He had been 88 for 2 months, and the nurse on the phone did not use the word soon, but she did not need to. I called the hospice and got my shift covered, which took me 20 minutes of apologetic phone calls, and I picked Penny-Rose up from school early, and we drove west into the mountains with a thermos of coffee between us and a bag of pretzels on her lap. Penny-Rose was quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet when something was happening that she did not yet understand, and I reached over at one point and put my hand on her knee, and she covered it with her own small hand, and we drove like that for a long time. The road climbed and climbed, and the hemlocks leaned in over the asphalt, and the light turned that late afternoon gold that makes everything in the Blue Ridge look as if it is remembering itself. My grandfather Felix had been the last of my mother's line still living, and my mother had been gone for 11 years by then, and he and I had a bond that is hard to describe to someone who did not grow up with the smell of his pipe tobacco and the rasp of his voice reading to me from the almanac. He had been a mountain man in the best sense of the phrase. He had taught school for 32 years and then kept bees, and then repaired clocks, and he had always said that a person needed 3 vocations in a life in order to understand the first one. When I walked into his hospital room that evening, he looked up from the pillow, and his eyes, which were that same riverstone gray-green that Penny-Rose had inherited through me, lit up in a way that almost undid me. "There's my girl," he said, and his voice was thin, but it was his. "And there is my great girl." Penny-Rose went to the bedside and let him cup her cheek with a hand that shook only a little, and he studied her face the way a man studies a map he is proud of. "You look like your grandmother," he told her, which is the finest thing I can say about a face. Penny-Rose smiled at that, and I think she understood, in the way children sometimes do, that this was a sentence she would carry for the rest of her life. I sat with him for hours. Penny-Rose eventually curled up in the chair in the corner with her notebook, and the machines beeped their small patient rhythms, and the light outside the window turned blue and then black. My grandfather slept in small increments and woke again, and each time he woke, he looked for me first, and each time I said, "I'm here, Papa," and each time he nodded and closed his eyes again. Around midnight, when Penny-Rose was truly asleep, he opened his eyes and held out his hand for mine, and I gave it to him, and he tightened his fingers around my fingers with a strength I did not think he still had. "Cora," he said, "I need you to listen to me now because I'm not going to have the breath to say this twice." "I'm listening, Papa," I said. "I left you the schoolhouse," he said. "It's in the file with the county. The papers are with a man named Bellweather in Boone. It is yours, and you are to let no one take it from you. Do you hear me, Cora? No one. Not the state. Not your mother-in-law. Not a man from any bank. "Do you hear me?" I told him I heard him. I told him I did not understand, but I heard him. He smiled a small smile that was mostly for himself, and he said, "You will understand. You were always the one who would understand." And then he closed his eyes, and his hand relaxed in mine, and I sat there with him until the sky over the mountains turned the color of an old nickel, and he slipped out of the room before sunrise, the way he had always preferred to leave a place. I drove home with Penny Rose asleep against my shoulder, and I did not cry until we crossed into our own county, because I did not want her to wake up to the sound of it. I kept thinking about his voice saying the word schoolhouse, and I could not picture what he meant, and I was so tired that for a long stretch of the highway I thought I might be dreaming the whole thing. The funeral was small and at the edge of a pasture, and I wore a black dress that had belonged to my mother, and Penny Rose held my hand through all of it. Mr. Orson Bellweather was there, a tall, quiet man in his mid-50s with close-cut silver at his temples, and a manner so precise and so kind that I understood at once why my grandfather had trusted him. He introduced himself at the graveside, and he said, "When you are ready, Mrs. Brockett-Wren, come to my office in Boone. There is no hurry, but there are things your grandfather wanted you to have, and he wanted you to hear them from me." It took me a week to be ready, and when I drove back up into the mountains with Penny Rose beside me because she had asked to come and because I had made a decision, when Tate died, that I would not shut her out of the rooms where our lives were being decided. Orson Bellweather's office was in an old brick building on a side street in Boone, above a bakery, and the stairway smelled of yeast and coffee. His office was small and tidy, with shelves of law books and a single window overlooking the street and a framed photograph of his wife and 2 sons on the desk. He rose when we came in and shook my hand and Penny Rose's hand with equal seriousness, and I appreciated that more than I could say. "Mrs. Brockett-Wren," he said, settling behind his desk, "your grandfather left a very simple will. There are a few items of personal property, his pipes, his almanacs, his clockmaking tools, which he has asked be distributed to specific friends, and I have the list here. And there is one piece of real property, which he has left entirely to you." "The schoolhouse," I said, because my grandfather's voice was still in my ear. "The schoolhouse," he agreed. "The one-room schoolhouse on Gilead Creek Road in Avery County. It is listed on the county property rolls at a valuation of $1, which is a tax designation for buildings of historic status that are no longer in active use. The parcel on the rolls lists the building only. I want you to remember that, Mrs. Brockett-Wren. The rolls list the building only." I did not understand at that moment why he was emphasizing that phrase, and I simply nodded. He handed me a thin manila folder with my name written on it in my grandfather's careful hand, and inside there were 2 keys on a brass ring, a small sealed envelope marked "For the Blackboard," and the deed to the property, and the tax card, and a photograph of the schoolhouse taken some decades ago, with my grandfather standing in front of it as a young man, holding a lunch pail and squinting into the sun. And it was at that exact moment that the door to Mr. Bellweather's outer office opened, and Tatianna Wren walked in, wearing a gray wool coat and her customary expression of wounded superiority, and I understood that someone had told her about the reading, and I understood that the someone was most likely herself because she had always had a way of being where she was not invited. Mr. Bellweather rose and said very politely, "Mrs. Wren, this is a private matter." And Tatianna said very politely in return, "I am family," which was a use of the word family that she had always reserved for moments when she wanted to enter a room. I told Mr. Bellweather that it was all right. I did not want a fight in that little office, not on that day. Tatianna sat down in the chair nearest the door, and she looked at the folder on my lap, and she looked at the photograph, and she gave a small laugh that was not a laugh. "A schoolhouse," she said. "Well, pay your own utility bills, Cora. A schoolhouse won't buy diapers." Penny Rose, who was 12 years old and who had never been called a diaper in her life, turned her riverstone eyes on her grandmother with a flat, level look that I had not known she was capable of, and Tatianna looked away first. That was a small victory, and I took it because I was at that time collecting small victories the way other people collected coins in a jar. Mr. Bellweather finished the reading with professional calm, and when Tatianna left, he waited a full minute before he spoke again. Then he said very quietly, "Your grandfather told me, Mrs. Brockett-Wren, that you would be tested before you were trusted. I believe that is what he meant by it." I did not know what he meant either, but I thanked him, and I took the folder, and Penny Rose and I walked back down the stairs past the bakery and out into the cold sunlight of a mountain afternoon. We did not drive to Gilead Creek Road that day. I was too tired, and I wanted to look at the map first, and I wanted to say the name of the road out loud a few times before I put my tires on it. Gilead Creek. My grandfather had told me once that his own grandmother had been born in a cabin on Gilead Creek in the winter of 1871, and I had forgotten that until I saw the name on the paperwork. We drove home, and I put the folder on the kitchen table, and I did not open it again until Saturday morning, when the light was good, and I had slept a full 7 hours for the first time in a month. Saturday came cold and clear, with the kind of sky that western North Carolina gives you in the spring before the leaves have come in, a blue so deep it looks painted. Penny Rose came into the kitchen in her jeans and her pink fleece jacket and her hair in 2 thick braids, and she said, "Are we going today, Mama?" And I said, "We are going today, baby." I packed a cooler with sandwiches and apples and a thermos of coffee, and I threw in a broom and a dustpan and a roll of trash bags and a box of cleaning rags and a flashlight with fresh batteries, because I had a feeling that whatever we were driving to, it would not be tidy. The drive took us almost 3 hours. We went north and west into the higher country, past little crossroads towns with 1 gas station and 1 post office and a cafe with a hand-lettered sign. We turned off the state road onto a county road, and then off the county road onto a gravel road, and then off the gravel road onto a narrower gravel road that wound up alongside a creek the color of steeped tea. The hemlocks closed over the top of the road in a green tunnel, and the light came down through them in long, slanting columns, and Penny Rose rolled down her window and breathed in the air, which was cold and sharp and smelled of moss and running water. The road took a final bend, and there it was. The schoolhouse sat in a clearing at the bend of the creek, a 1-room building of whitewashed clapboard with a steep roof of old green-painted tin and a square bell tower at the peak, the bell still hanging inside it, tarnished with age but still there. Hemlocks stood around it like tall green pillars, some of them 150 feet high, and the ground under them was soft with fallen needles, and a rusted iron flagpole stood in the yard with no flag on it and its cord long since broken. Behind the building, I could see the creek moving over flat stones, and to one side there was a small lean-to that must once have been a woodshed, and to the other side a tiny cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, with smoke rising from its chimney. I parked the truck and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not felt loosen in a long time. Penny Rose said, "Mama, it's like a storybook." And I said, "I know, baby," because it was. We got out. The brass key on my grandfather's ring fit the old iron lock in the schoolhouse door, and the door opened with a long, slow sigh, the hinges complaining but giving way. The smell that came out was the smell of old wood and chalk dust and mice and cold stone, and under all of it the faint sweetness of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. Because he had been coming here, I would soon learn, every Sunday afternoon for most of his long life. The inside of the schoolhouse was 1 long room with a high ceiling and pine floorboards worn to a soft gray. At the far end stood a teacher's desk of dark oak, and behind it, taking up most of the back wall, a vast slate blackboard framed in wood and fastened to the stone chimney behind it. A potbelly stove squatted in the middle of the room with a black iron pipe that ran up into the ceiling. 4 rows of cast-iron desks, each with a wooden top and a small hinged inkwell, Faced the front and along the side wall, a row of coat hooks held nothing but cobwebs. Over the teacher's desk, a framed daguerreotype hung in a thin gilt frame, a stern young woman in a high collar and dark dress, and beneath her a hand-lettered card that read, Miss Cordelia Hartshorn, Schoolmistress, 1897. I walked up the center aisle slowly, and my boots made a soft thump on the pine boards, and Penny Rose walked beside me with her hand in mine, and neither of us said anything until we reached the front. The chalkboard still had writing on it. In a faded ghost of chalk, a lesson was half finished. The Mississippi River is the longest river in, it read, and then the chalk had run out, or the bell had rung, and the sentence had never been completed. I imagined the last teacher turning at the sound of the bell, putting down the chalk and going out for the last time and never coming back. "Mama," Penny Rose said, her voice small in that big room, "this is the most beautiful place I've ever been." I think I knew, even then, that she was right, though I could not have said why. We had been in the schoolhouse for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard a footstep on the porch, and the door creaked open, and an old man in faded blue overalls stood in the doorway, leaning lightly on a carved walking stick. He had white hair that stood up in a soft halo, and a face like a folded map, and eyes of a mild and watchful blue. He took off his cap when he saw us and held it against his chest. "You must be Felix's Cora," he said, and his voice was the creaking pine of the mountains, the kind of voice that comes from breathing this air your whole life. "I am," I said. "I am Abel McCutcheon," he said. "They call me Deacon. I live next door, in the little cabin yonder, and I have lived there since 1953, which is the year my father built it. I am the last trustee of this school. I have been the trustee since 1987, which is the year the state finally closed us for good. I knew your grandfather. I knew him better than most people knew him, I think, and I would like to shake your hand if I may." I went to him and shook his hand, and his grip was dry and firm and respectful, and he smiled at Penny Rose and shook her hand too, with the same gravity he had shown me. Then he stepped into the room and looked around with the slow, deliberate gaze of a man who knew every board of a place. "Your grandfather," Deacon Abel said, "came here every Sunday afternoon of his life, as near as I can tell, and sat at that teacher's desk and looked at that blackboard until 3 months ago. 3 months ago, he came to my cabin and sat at my kitchen table, and he said, 'Abel, I am not going to be able to come up here any more. My heart won't take the drive.' And that was the last time he came." Deacon Abel's eyes were bright and fixed on mine. "I have always wondered why a man would drive 3 hours each way, every week, to sit in an empty schoolhouse and look at a blackboard. Do you know, Mrs. Wren? Did he ever tell you?" "He never told me," I said, and my voice caught. "But I think he was waiting for me to ask." Deacon Abel nodded, as if that were the answer he had expected. "Then you are the one he was waiting for," he said. "And I am glad you have come." He stayed for another hour. That first day, he told us the history of the schoolhouse, how it had been built in 1897 by the men of 4 hollers who had chipped in lumber and labor, how Miss Cordelia Hartshorn had come up from Hickory to teach the first class of 19 children, how the school had served 4 generations before the state consolidation of 1987 had finally closed it. He told us that my grandfather had been in the last class of full graduates in 1948, and that he had been the valedictorian, and that he had stood on the front porch of this very building and given a speech about the dignity of mountain learning that the older folks still talked about. He told us these things in his unhurried mountain voice, and Penny Rose listened with her mouth slightly open, and I listened with a growing understanding that I had inherited something I did not yet understand the shape of. When he left, he paused at the door and said, "If you need anything, Mrs. Wren, you come knock on my cabin door, day or night. Your grandfather asked me, before he left the last time, to look after his granddaughter when she came. He said he was sure she would come. I could not speak for a moment. I just nodded, and Deacon Abel nodded back, and he put on his cap and walked out across the clearing toward his little cabin with its plume of smoke, and I stood in the doorway and watched him go. And I felt, for the first time in 23 months and 11 days, that I was not entirely alone in the world. We spent the rest of that first day just sitting. We ate our sandwiches at the teacher's desk. Penny Rose drew pictures in her notebook of the bell tower and the daguerreotype. I walked the perimeter of the building and found the old well and the privy, long since collapsed, and the grown-over path that led down to the creek, where a flat stone still made a natural step into the clear brown water. I put my hand in the water, and the cold of it ran up my arm and into my shoulder, and I felt awake in a way I had not been awake in a long time. That night, we drove home in the dark, the headlights of the Ford cutting a tunnel through the trees, and Penny Rose fell asleep against my shoulder, and I thought about the blackboard with its half-finished sentence and the way the chalk letters floated in the gloom. The Mississippi River is the longest river in. It read in my head, over and over, like a hymn with a missing line. The cleaning took us a full week of weekends, plus 2 evenings in between when I drove up after a short shift, and we worked by the light of the 2 kerosene lanterns Deacon Abel lent us. We wore bandanas over our mouths for the dust, and we scrubbed the pine floors with a mop and a bucket of warm water and vinegar, and we polished the iron desk with soft cloths, and we washed the windows until the glass rang when you tapped it. Penny Rose took to the work with a seriousness that surprised me, the way she took the rag and worked at each inkwell until it gleamed, the way she polished the little brass hinges. She told me, on the 3rd day, that she felt as if the schoolhouse was watching her, and she did not want it to think she was not taking care of it. On the 4th day, Penny Rose was at the teacher's desk polishing its surface, and she stopped, and she said, "Mama, come look." I came around to her side and knelt beside the desk. She ran her finger along the edge of the wooden top, near where a right-handed student would rest his arm, and there, carved deep into the oak with the patience of a schoolboy with a pocket-knife, were the initials F.U. 1948. "Felix Upchurch," I said softly. "He sat here." "He sat here," Penny Rose repeated. "Mama, he sat in this very chair." I put my hand over the initials, and I felt the old gouge of the blade in the wood, and I thought of a 17-year-old boy in a hand-me-down shirt carving his name into a desk that he did not yet know he would someday own, and I sat down on the floor next to the desk and cried for a long time. And Penny Rose sat down next to me and put her head on my shoulder, and we did not say anything for a while. Deacon Abel came and went during that week, bringing us a jar of honey and a tin of biscuits, and, on the last day, a small framed photograph of the 1948 graduating class, 19 young people on the porch of the schoolhouse, with my grandfather in the back row, tall and serious and holding a rolled diploma. "Your grandfather gave me this years ago," Deacon Abel said. "He told me to give it back to whoever came to clean the place. He said that way he would know." I took the photograph and hung it next to the daguerreotype of Miss Cordelia Hartshorn, and the 2 pictures faced each other across the room, the first schoolmistress and the last valedictorian, and I felt as if the building had exhaled. It was the following Sunday that everything changed. I had told Penny Rose that on Sunday we would do the last of the cleaning, and then we would sit and just be in the schoolhouse for a while, because I wanted to feel what my grandfather had felt when he sat here. We arrived a little before noon. The sun was high and clean, and a red-tailed hawk was turning lazy circles over the clearing. I started on the blackboard, which I had been saving for last because I did not want to erase the faint ghost of the sentence about the Mississippi River until I had decided whether to erase it at all. I had brought a soft cloth and a bucket of warm water with just a little vinegar in it, and I began at the top left corner, washing away a century of chalk in slow circles. Penny Rose was at the teacher's desk, sorting through a box of old readers we had found in a closet. I'd been working for perhaps 10 minutes when I heard her say, softly, "Mama?" "Yes, baby?" "Come feel this." I set down the cloth and came to where she was standing beside the blackboard at the right edge of its wooden frame. She took my hand and guided my fingers to a spot along the inside of the frame, where the wood met the stone of the fireplace behind it. "Feel right there," she said. I ran my fingertips along the seam, and at first I felt nothing, and then I felt it. A hairline crack in the wood, too straight to be a crack, running vertically from the top of the frame to the bottom. Not a crack, a seam. "Press it," Penny Rose said. I pressed it. There was a small click, a click like the latch of a very old box, and then, slowly, with a quiet grinding of iron on iron that had not been oiled in 100 years, the entire blackboard slid sideways on hidden tracks set into the top and bottom of its wooden frame. It moved perhaps 18 inches to the left, and then it stopped, and we stood in the empty schoolhouse in the sudden sunlit silence, and we looked at what had been hidden behind it. Set into the stone of the old fireplace, where the flue would have risen, was a square cast-iron door, about 2 feet on a side, black with a century of soot and chalk dust and age, its hinges heavy, its face marked with a single brass combination dial and a brass handle. A small brass plate above the dial read, in raised letters, "Mosler Safe Company, Hamilton, Ohio, 1894. Penny Rose said in a voice so small I almost did not hear it, "Mama, that's a safe." "That's a safe," I said, and I sat down on the nearest iron desk because my knees had gone out from under me. I do not know how long we sat there staring at it. Long enough for the sun to move across the floor, long enough for a chipmunk to run across the porch, and for the hawk to call once, twice, 3 times over the clearing. Finally, Penny Rose said, "Mama, the envelope." "What envelope?" "The envelope in the file. From the lawyer. It said, for the blackboard, Mama. It said, for the blackboard." I was out the door and across the clearing to the truck before she had finished speaking, and I came back with the folder from Mr. Bellweather, and I sat down at the teacher's desk, and I opened the folder with hands that were shaking. And I found the small white envelope with my grandfather's careful handwriting on the front. For the blackboard. I had thought, when I first saw it, that it was a note about the chalkboard itself, a piece of sentiment, a scrap of poetry. I had not opened it. I opened it now. Inside was a single slip of paper, also in my grandfather's hand with 3 numbers written on it. 18, 97, 48. 18, I said aloud. 97, 48. "The year the school was founded," Penny Rose said, "and the year Papa graduated." 1897 and 1948, I said, and my hand went to my mouth. He used the school itself as the combination. I walked to the safe. I knelt in front of it, on the hearthstones of the old fireplace, and I put my hand on the brass dial, and I turned it 3 times to the right to clear it, and then I turned it slowly left to 18, and then right to 97, and then left to 48, and at the last click I heard a small internal mechanism release, and I pulled the brass handle, and the iron door swung open with the slow weight of something that had not moved in many decades. I want to say that I opened it boldly, that I reached in without hesitation, but the truth is that I sat back on my heels for a full minute and simply looked into the dark square of it because my grandfather's voice was in my ear saying, "Let no one take it from you," and I wanted to honor the weight of what he had asked. Penny Rose knelt beside me, and together we leaned forward, and I turned on the flashlight from my bag and shone it into the vault. The first thing I saw was a stack of papers tied with faded red string. I lifted it out with both hands and carried it to the teacher's desk. The string crumbled a little when I untied it, and the top paper was an engraved certificate with an eagle and a flag, and the words, "United States of America, War Savings, Series E" across the top. A Liberty Bond, a defense bond from 1944. Beneath it was another, and another, and another. There were, I would later count, 42 of them in denominations ranging from $100 to $1,000, each one bearing my grandfather's careful signature and a date from the war years and the years just after. I went back to the safe. I lifted out a small velvet box, cracked with age but still sound, and when I opened it, I saw rows of coins laid in velvet slots, buffalo nickels in bright condition, Morgan silver dollars, a few gold pieces that I was afraid to touch, all of them neatly labeled with tiny slips of paper in my grandfather's hand. I went back a third time, and I lifted out a thick envelope, and inside the envelope was a deed. Not the deed I had been given by Mr. Bellweather. A different deed, older, written in the long hand of the 19th century, showing the original grant of the schoolhouse property. Not the half-acre building lot that appeared on the modern county rolls, but 80 acres of creek bottom and mountainside, patented in 1896 to the Gilead Creek Common School Trust, with my grandfather named as the sole surviving trustee and heir. The modern tax card had been wrong. The modern tax card had been, Mr. Bellweather had carefully hinted, wrong, for a long time. I went back a fourth time. I lifted out a sealed letter, heavy paper, addressed in my grandfather's hand to Cora Brockett-Wren, and I went back a fifth time, and at the very back of the vault, wrapped in oilcloth, I found 3 small framed maps, hand-drawn in pencil and ink on yellowed paper, each of them labeled in the upper corner. Claim number 1, claim number 2, claim number 3, Upchurch Silver. Claim, Gilead Creek Drainage. Each was dated 5 years before, signed by my grandfather, and stamped by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources. Each was registered in the name of Cora Brockett-Wren. I sat down on the hearthstones with the 3 maps across my lap, and I did not cry. I was past crying. I simply looked at them, at the careful drawings of a silver vein my grandfather had quietly located and quietly registered and quietly kept for me 5 years before he died. And I thought about the man who had driven 3 hours each way every Sunday of his life to sit in a schoolhouse and look at a blackboard. And I understood that he had been guarding a promise and that the promise had been me. Penny Rose sat next to me on the stones, and she put her head against my shoulder, and she said, "Mama, Papa loved you a lot." "He did, baby," I said. "He did." I opened the letter that night, after Penny Rose had gone to bed at home, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside me. My grandfather's handwriting was as clear as a bell. "Cora," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found the door behind the blackboard, and you have found what I hid there over a lifetime. And I want you to know, my girl, that none of it was for me. When your mother died and left you a child of 31 with a new husband and a new baby, I promised her that I would put something aside for you, and I have been putting aside ever since. The bonds I bought when I was a young man, the coins I collected from my father and my grandfather, the silver claim I located 5 years ago when I walked the drainage with your cousin's surveyor. I have put them here, in the safest place I knew, which is the schoolhouse where I was shaped into a man. The combination is the year this school was built and the year it set me free. If you have solved it, you are ready. Take what is yours, Cora. Pay no attention to anyone who tells you it is not enough or too much. It is exactly what I wanted to give. Your Papa. F.U. I folded the letter and held it against my chest for a long time, and then I put it in the drawer where I kept the things that mattered most, and I went to bed. The following Tuesday, I called Mr. Bellweather, and I told him what we had found, and he was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Mrs. Brockett-Wren, your grandfather told me that if you called me with news, I was to arrange for an appraiser, He recommended a woman by the name of Wendeline Avery Pope out of Asheville. She is one of the finest bond and mineral appraisers in the Southeast, and she has worked with our firm for 15 years. If you authorize it, I will have her drive up this Friday. I authorized it, and on Friday morning I drove up to Gilead Creek Road with Penny Rose, and we met Ms. Avery Pope in the clearing. She was a woman of about 50, slim and composed, with silver-black hair cut in a sharp bob and small wire-rimmed glasses and a dark wool coat that looked expensive and practical at the same time. She carried a leather satchel and a small, hard-sided case of instruments. She shook my hand with a firm, professional grip, and she said, "Mrs. Brockett-Wren, thank you for calling. Mr. Bellweather has briefed me. May I see what you have found?" I took her inside, and I showed her the open safe, and I laid out the bonds on the teacher's desk, and I set out the velvet box, and I unrolled the 3 maps, and I stepped back. She put on a pair of white cotton gloves, and she sat down at the desk, and she began her work, and I watched her for most of the afternoon. She examined the bonds, one by one, checking serial numbers against a reference book she had brought, making notes in a small leather notebook in a precise, almost musical hand. She took each coin out of the velvet box and examined it under a jeweler's loupe, testing the weight of the silver ones on a small brass scale. She spread the mine claim maps on the floor and studied them for a long time, and she asked me questions about the drainage and the access road and whether there had been any drilling or sampling done, and I answered what I could from what I had read in my grandfather's file. It was late afternoon when she finally took off the gloves, closed her notebook, and looked up at me. Penny Rose and I were sitting in the front row of iron desks, the way students might have sat waiting for a lesson, and Wendeline Avery Pope was behind the teacher's desk, the daguerreotype of Miss Cordelia Hartshorn on the wall behind her. She folded her hands. "Mrs. Brockett-Wren," she said, "I want to be careful, because I do not want to overstate anything, and I do not want to make promises about a mining claim until it is drilled. But here is what I can tell you today. The bonds are genuine, and they are in excellent condition. And based on my calculation of face value plus accrued interest over the years they have been held, they are currently worth approximately $340,000, redeemable at any federal depository. The coin collection is extraordinary. The Morgan dollars alone are nearly all in mint or near-mint state. I would conservatively value the collection at $180,000 on the numismatic market, possibly more at auction. I heard Penny Rose let out a small breath beside me. "The mine claim," Wendeline Avery Pope went on, "is another matter. Your grandfather filed 3 legitimate claims, properly registered, on land that is part of your 80-acre parcel. The corrected deed Mr. Bellweather will be filing reestablishes your mineral rights. I have reviewed the hand-drawn maps and the geology of the drainage, and I can tell you that this area has historically produced silver, and that the vein your grandfather identified appears, on paper, to be consistent with known formations in the region. Depending on the quality of the vein, which we will not know until a proper assay is done, the claim could be worth anywhere from a few $100,000 to, in the upper range, up to $2.4 million. I do not say this lightly. I have seen perhaps a dozen claims of this quality in my career." I sat very still in the iron desk, with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not move for what felt like a long time. Penny Rose was watching me. Wendeline Avery Pope was watching me. Outside, the hawk was calling again over the clearing. I did not speak. I stood up. I walked out of the schoolhouse, and I walked to the porch steps, and I sat down, and I put my face in my hands, and I felt every single thing I had carried for 23 months and 3 weeks rise up into my chest all at once. The electric bill, the propane tank, the slipping transmission, the Saturdays I had not been able to buy her new shoes, the nights I had eaten cereal for dinner so there would be enough lunch for her the next day, Tate's canvas coat over my scrubs in the cold cab of the Ford, Tatianna on the phone saying you can't even afford to keep the lights on. I sat on the porch steps, of the old schoolhouse. And I cried, the way I had not cried at the funeral and had not cried at the hospital, and had not cried in the kitchen at home. And after a few minutes, Penny Rose came and sat beside me and put her arm around my shoulders. And she did not say anything, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had always known when to be quiet. After a long while, Gwendoline Avery Pope came out and stood on the porch with us. She did not speak for a minute. Then she said very gently, "Mrs. Brockett-Wren, your grandfather loved you very much." "He did," I said, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "I will draw up a full written report," she said, "and I will give you the names of 3 people I trust to take the next steps: a bond redemption specialist, a coin auction house, and a geologist for the claim. You do not have to decide anything today. You do not have to decide anything this month. Take your time." I thanked her, and I stood, and I walked her to her car, and I shook her hand, and she drove off down the gravel road in a long plume of dust. That night, I wanted to tell you that I slept, but I did not. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I did math that I had not done in years. I did math with the lights on, and no worry about the meter. I did math with a clear head, and I understood that I could pay off the house. I could replace the truck. I could set aside enough for Penny Rose's education. I could, if I was careful, stop working nights, at least for a while, and be home when she came in from school. But the math that mattered most to me that night was not the math of dollars. It was the math of what I had been given. Not just money, an inheritance of care. 42 bonds that a young man had bought one at a time over the course of a decade for a granddaughter who did not yet exist. A coin collection that had been passed down for 3 generations. A mine claim that had been walked and surveyed and filed 5 years before, quietly, so that a widow would have something to stand on if the road got steep. A schoolhouse. A promise. A man who drove 3 hours each way every Sunday of his life to sit in an empty building and look at a blackboard and wait for his girl to come. I want to pause here for a moment because I do not want to race through this story the way a river races to the sea. If you are listening, and if my grandfather's steady love has reached you through the static of an ordinary day, I would just ask you to sit with it for a moment. Think about who has sat in an empty room for you. Think about who is still sitting. And then, if you'd like, stay with me, because there is more of this story. And it is not only about what was found, it is about what got healed. Word of the appraisal did not stay quiet because word never does stay quiet in these mountains. Mr. Bellweather handled everything with his customary discretion, and Gwendoline Avery Pope was a professional of the highest order. But small towns have their own hydraulics, and within 2 weeks, the story of the schoolhouse and the safe behind the blackboard had reached every porch and every beauty parlor and every feed store in 3 counties. I began to get phone calls I did not answer, from numbers I did not know, and I began to get looks in the grocery store, and I began to understand that my life had changed in ways I would have to manage. What I had not expected was the knock on the schoolhouse door on a Saturday afternoon in late April. A soft, hesitant knock, and when I opened the door, Tatianna Wren stood on the porch in her gray wool coat and her eyes were red, and she was holding a paper grocery bag with both hands. We looked at each other for a long moment. The hawk was wheeling over the clearing. The creek was running over its flat stones. Tatiana's lower lip was trembling the way her son's had trembled once when he was trying not to say something that hurt him. "Cora," she said, "may I come in?" I stepped aside and let her in. She came into the schoolhouse and she stood in the middle of the aisle, between the iron desks, and she looked around, at the scrubbed pine floor and the polished inkwells and the daguerreotype of Miss Cordelia Hartshorn and the photograph of the 1948 class, and she looked at the open blackboard, still standing half-slid on its iron tracks, and she looked at the empty iron safe behind it, and she set her grocery bag down on one of the desks, and she sat down suddenly in the iron chair, as if her legs would not hold her. "I brought a loaf of banana bread," she said. "I didn't know what else to bring." I went to the potbelly stove. I had been keeping a small kettle on it on the weekends, more for the comfort of the sound than for anything else, and I poured hot water into 2 of the chipped china cups I had found in the closet with the old readers. I dropped a tea bag in each, and I carried them over. And I set one in front of Tatianna, and I sat down in the desk across the aisle from her, and we sat there for a long time without speaking. "Cora," she finally said. Her voice was not the voice she had used on the phone. It was a voice I had not heard her use since the funeral. "Cora, I need to say something to you, and I need to say it all the way through without stopping, or I will not be able to say it at all." "Go on," I said. "When Tate died," she said, "I could not bear it. He was my only son. He was my only child. I had carried him for 9 months, and I had raised him for 29 years, and I had loved him every single day of his life. And then a tree came off a hillside, and he was gone. And there was no one to blame. No one. There was no drunk driver, there was no careless foreman, there was no mistake that anyone could have prevented. It was just a tree. A tree did not know it was killing my son. A tree cannot be sued or hated or forgiven, and I could not live with that, Cora. I could not live with a grief that had nowhere to go. So I sent it to you. I told myself that if you had not let him take that contract, if you had not needed the money, if you had been a different kind of wife, he would still be alive. I knew it was not true. I knew it the day I started saying it. I said it anyway." She stopped. She put her hand over her mouth. I waited. "I blamed you," she said, "because I could not blame anyone else. And I have hurt you for 2 years with that, Cora. I have said cruel things to you on the telephone. I have said cruel things to you in stores. I have said cruel things about you to people in our church. I have tried to take Penny Rose from you, not because I thought you were a bad mother, because I have never thought that, not for 1 second, but because I wanted one piece of my son back, and she was the piece I could see. I was wrong. I was wrong, Cora, and I am sorry, and I do not ask you to forgive me because I do not deserve it, but I had to say it out loud before I died." She was crying openly now, not the wounded tears I had seen from her before, but the deep, shoulder-shaking sob of a woman who had finally set something heavy down. The schoolhouse held it. The pine boards held it. The iron desks held it. Miss Cordelia Hartshorn watched us from her frame. I set my tea down. I got up, and I walked across the aisle. And I sat down in the desk next to Tatianna, and I put my hand over her hand. And I held it the way she had never let me hold it before. "I know," I said softly. "I know. Come sit for a while." She cried into my shoulder for a long time, and I cried some too, and outside the hemlocks moved in the wind, and the creek went on running over its flat stones. And when it was over, we sat with our hands around our chipped china cups, and we talked about Tate. For the first time in 2 years, we talked about him. About how he sang off-key, about how he knew the names of all the birds, about how he had carried Penny Rose on his shoulders at the county fair when she was 3, and she had fallen asleep up there, and he had walked her home that way 2 miles without waking her. About how he had loved his mother. About how he had loved me. About how we had both been luckier than we knew, for a long time. And about how the luck had not been taken away because it had happened. It had simply happened, the luck and the loss, in the same life, and we were going to carry both. Before she left, Tatianna stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and looked back at me, and she said, "Cora, when you are ready, I would like to be a grandmother again. I would like to come to her soccer games. I would like to teach her to make biscuits the way Tate liked them. If you will let me." "I will let you," I said. "She needs you." Tatianna went down the porch steps, and she got in her car, and she drove down the gravel road. and I stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched her taillights disappear, and I understood that another kind of vault had just been unlocked, and that what it held was not silver, but something more useful. The spring turned into summer, and the summer turned slowly, the way mountain summers do, and Penny Rose and I drove up to Gilead Creek Road nearly every weekend. I stopped working the overnight shifts at the hospice and took only day shifts twice a week, because I had promised myself that I would be home in the evenings. We paid off the house. We bought a used pickup truck that did not slip. I put aside what Wendeline Avery Pope had told me to put aside in the accounts she had recommended with the advisors she had vetted, and I did not touch it. The mine claim, for the record, turned out to be modest rather than spectacular. The geologist Wendeline sent up walked the drainage with me in my grandfather's maps and took samples, and the assay came back with a silver grade that was real and commercial, but that was not a bonanza. And in the end, I leased the claim to a small, family-owned mining company out of Johnson City, Tennessee on a royalty basis, which meant a steady monthly income rather than a single, large payout. I preferred it that way. My grandfather, I think, would have preferred it that way too. But the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was the thing that stayed with me. On the first cool day of September, I opened the door of the Gilead Creek Common School, one-room schoolhouse founded 1897, for the first time in 38 years, as a place where children would come. Not as a school, exactly. I had no license to teach and no intention to try. I opened it as a free after-school reading room for the children of the hollers around Gilead Creek whose parents worked long hours and whose libraries were far and whose winters were long. We put bookshelves along the side walls between the coat hooks. We kept the iron desks because the children liked them. We kept the potbelly stove because the stove had more sense about warming a room than any modern thing ever built. Deacon Abel volunteered to shelve the books and to keep the stove burning in cold weather, and he was there every afternoon by 3 o'clock in his overalls with a thermos of coffee and his carved walking stick. Penny Rose, now 13, ran the children's section, reading aloud to the younger ones and keeping a careful log in a spiral notebook of who had borrowed what. Tatianna drove up from the foothills twice a month, and she sat in one of the iron desks with a little boy named Jonah, and patiently taught him to read the word mountain. I did not charge a penny for any of it. I had been given something I had not earned, something that had been built up for me by a man who had loved me quietly and patiently for decades, and it felt right that what I did with it should be given away in the same way it had been given to me, quietly, patiently, without any expectation of return. The bonds paid for the bookshelves and the new roof, and the electric heat we installed as a backup for the stove. The coin collection paid for a new well and a composting toilet in the back, because the old privy was not coming back. The mine royalties paid the modest salary of a part-time librarian, a young woman from the next holler who had wanted to be a teacher and had not been able to afford the degree. On the first day, the reading room opened. 14 children came. By Christmas, we had 31 regulars. By the following spring, we had 47, and we had to add a second row of shelves along the back wall. I kept the half-finished sentence on the blackboard. I did not wash it off. The Mississippi River is the longest river in. It had been waiting there for a century, and I decided it could wait a little longer because it seemed to me that some sentences are better as invitations than as completions. The children made up their own endings. One little girl wrote, underneath the original line in a careful chalk hand, "The longest river in the world, but not as long as my grandfather's love." I left that one up for a whole winter. I still think about that morning, the one I started this story with, the morning I came off my shift with Ellery's hand, still warm in my memory and the phone ringing with Tatianna's cold voice and the propane tank at 11%. I still think about the woman I was then pulling off onto the shoulder with a crow on a fence post, and I want to reach back to her and put my hand on her shoulder and tell her that it will bend. It will bend, It will bend, the road will bend, and around the bend there will be a schoolhouse in a clearing and an old man who drove 3 hours every Sunday to sit in it for her. I did not earn any of it. That is what I want to say more than anything. I did not earn the schoolhouse. I did not earn the safe behind the Blackboard. I did not earn the 42 bonds, or the Buffalo nickels, or the silver claim in the drainage. Those were gifts. They were given to me by a man who had decided, 60 years before, that his line would not end with him, and that his love would outlive him. I did, however, earn something else. I earned the right to be the person who received it. I earned that by staying, by holding Penny Rose's hand through the drop-off line every morning, by holding Ellery's hand at the end of his life and telling him he had been a good father, by pulling off onto the shoulder when Tatianna's voice cut through me and crying for exactly as long as it took the crow to cross the field, and then putting the truck in drive, by not sitting down in the middle of the road. We inherit in 2 directions, I have learned. We inherit what is handed to us, the tangible things, the land, and the bonds, and the keys on a brass ring. But we also inherit through, which is to say, we become the channel for something that was meant for someone else, someone who is not yet born, someone who will sit in the iron desk we scrubbed, someone who will read a word on a blackboard we did not erase. The schoolhouse did not begin with my grandfather, and it did not end with me. It began with 19 children in 1897, and a young woman named Cordelia Hartshorn, who had ridden a wagon up from Hickory with a trunk of books and a piece of chalk. And it will end, I hope, long after Penny Rose is an old woman telling this story to children of her own. If you are listening tonight, and you are in a hard stretch and the math is not adding up, and there is no one on the other end of the phone who has anything kind to say, I want to tell you that you may already be the recipient of a love you have not yet discovered. Somebody may already have driven 3 hours every Sunday of their life to sit in an empty room for you. Somebody may already have hidden something behind a blackboard for you. You may not know it yet. It may come to you in a folder from a quiet attorney above a bakery in a small mountain town. And it may come to you as the apology of a woman you had stopped expecting anything from, and it may come to you as the hand of a 12-year-old girl guiding your fingers along a seam in a piece of old wood and saying, "Mama, press it, press it." My name is Cora Brockett-Wren, and I was widowed at 40, and I inherited a schoolhouse valued at $1, and inside it I found a life I did not know I had been given. I'm telling you this story because my grandfather, Felix Upchurch, asked me once, in the last hour of his life, whether I understood, and I told him I did not, but that I would. I understand now, Papa. I understand now. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Thank you for being the kind of listener who will follow a mountain road to its end. If this story stirred something in you, sit with it tonight. Call the person who has quietly loved you. Say the thing you have been meaning to say. And if you ever drive through the hollers of western North Carolina, up along Gilead Creek, and you see a whitewashed one-room schoolhouse with a bell tower and a rusted flagpole, and a porch where children are coming and going with books under their arms, you will know that you have found us, and you are welcome to come in, and there's always a cup of tea on the potbelly stove, and the Blackboard is still waiting to tell you about the longest river in the world.